And we're back for the final installment of KILMAINHAM Jail, Dublin, Ireland. We left off with this poster that is inviting, recruiting volunteers to help restore KILMAINHAM, to make it into an institution that would serve history, culture, and heritage. It took nearly 30 years of renovation. There's a lot going on during those 3 decades. You've heard me say repeatedly that KILMAINHAM is a storytelling institution, and it relies on performance. So in this last segment, let us take a final glimpse at this Victorian architecture, steel, glass, embodied in a modern penitentiary with panopticism. It's sometimes difficult to realize that such a beautiful building was used for purposes of inflicting pain and punishment on those confined here. Well, what we do as visitors is we suspend, oftentimes, our understanding that this is a place of pain by design. And now it is a place of awe, of architectural display that speaks to the imagination of prisons and their design. A visit to KILMAINHAM is very worthwhile. Don't forget your camera. (1916), the story that provides the cultural infrastructure of KILMAINHAM as a prison museum. That story does not end at KILMAINHAM. It actually travels across Dublin to this particular site. Sightedness, where things actually occurred. The 14 rebels from 1916, those who were executed by British forces, were then reburied in this particular cemetery. The sanctity of death, the lives of these rebels would not be forgotten. They would continue to resonate in Irish culture. It is precisely this location that John F. Kennedy, President of the U.S., spent time with other Irish dignitaries commemorating the 1916 rebels. The echo of Irish Americans and Native Irish is an important connection in the larger heritage of Irish politics. In addition to the cross, we also have inscribed in this stone the 1916 proclamation. Written first in Irish and secondly in the English language, commemorating 1916. as we step back, again, this is where the 1916 rebels were reburied. This is where the 1916 proclamation is written into stone. We step back and we examine from a semiotic standpoint this larger compound. And the more we know about this particular compound, the more complicated our feelings and interpretation become. Because whereas you have the 1916 proclamation and the rebels stationed in the back of this compound, in the foreground of this cemetery, you have British soldiers who were buried in the cemetery. British soldiers who died during the War of Independence. Now things are complicated. There is what we call semiotic tension. The message becomes a little bit more complicated. There's also an Anglican church on this compound. So now you have more religious tension between Catholics and Protestants. And off to your left, if you haven't noticed, that looks like a guard tower. And yes, that is a prison. A fully functioning prison on the same compound with the 1916 burial of the rebels, with British soldiers laid to rest from the War of Independence, with an Anglican church, and a prison that is even more controversial since it has a reputation of holding sex offenders, pedophiles. The semiotic tension between all of these messages on this one small piece of land requires some sociological reflection. This is the prison, Arbor Hill. Try to pull it together conceptually and theoretically. Now I'm going to morph back into my role as a professor, as an author. Political Imprisonment and the Sanctity of Death, Performing Heritage in Troubled Ireland. It's a project I worked on a few years ago when I was based at the London School of Economics, the Mannheim Center for Criminology, Department of Social Policy, as a visiting professor. And it is here that I began furthering my interest in sociological theory, particularly from a Durkheimian standpoint. Now, you've heard me talk in other episodes about Foucault, which is very much part of my framework from which I undergo sociological analysis. But here we have Durkheim, these socio-religious concepts. Now, in the few moments we have left in this final episode, I want to draw attention to Jessica Scarlata and an amazing book where she writes that imprisonment is a central trope of Irish nationalism, often deployed to portray the injustice of an Ireland occupied by foreign rule. Imprisonment is deeply embedded in the psyche of the culture of Irish people. And you might ask yourself, You know, I'd like to know a little bit more about these discoveries in Irish history and analysis. And I'm just going to scroll through a couple of items in the reference section here. You've heard me say that Kilmainham is the Bastille of Ireland. And there you have O'Dwyer's contribution. You also have Scarlata, Rethinking Occupied Ireland, Gender and Incarceration in Contemporary Irish Film. And I should perhaps plug this book of mine, Escape to Prison, Penal Tourism, and the Full Punishment, which is the foundation for a lot of these episodes and videos on prison museums. And the book that I am in the process of finishing called The Bastille Effect, Sites and Symbols of Political Imprisonment, incorporating my work in the Ireland, North and South, as well as the southern cone of Latin America, Canada, France, the list goes on. So, as we conclude, let's just take it all together, appreciate these larger storytelling institutions, and with that, I'm pleased to announce that the bar is open.